Good afternoon, everybody. It is an honor to be invited to speak here at CPHI. My name is Pei. I'm a specialist. Today, I will walk you through the entire review and approval process of imported API in China and share some knowledge and tips on earning API DMF approval. So this year, there are also two new policies introduced. One is regarding the joint review process with API and formulations that was announced at the end of April 30th. The other one is the new drug registration and administration law, which is going to be on full force of execution this July. So I will incorporate some of the changes brought by these two new regulations in my talk as well. So here is an outline of my talk today. It is divided by 4 parts. First part is imported API registration system. So in this section, I will briefly talk through some of the laws and regulations governing our current drug evaluation system, as well as some of the main organizations under MAPA. Second part is the requirements of DMF. I will talk through the CTD format as well as contents required, number 80 notice. Third part is the comparison of characteristics of Indian API industry and Chinese API industry. And for the last part, it is sort of a combined summary and distillation of the previous 3 parts, marrying some of the API agent and cell experiences of CSC, and I will talk about some of the conveniences and potential worries of choosing an Indian API, all from the perspective of Chinese domestic formulations. So the first part is an overall summary of imported API registration system. So let's walk through some of these main organizations under MAPA, as well as what they do. First, we have Center of Food and Drug Inspection, CFDI. They are responsible for auditing food, drug, medical appliances, and cosmetics. Next, we have National Institute for Food and Drug Control, NIFDC. They're responsible for testing drug, excipients, packaging materials, and medical appliances. They're also responsible for specification confirmation process of imported drugs, as well as testing at the custom entry point. Third, we have National Pharmacopedia Committee. They're in charge of organizing and writing the Chinese Pharmacopedia, as well as revising National Drug Specification. Lastly, but not least, we have Center of Drug Evaluation, CDE. They're in charge of technical review process of drug and expedient. All right. So the work of RA requires us to constantly keep up with the changes of laws and regulations. And there have been a lot of changes in the past 5 years. And I will walk you through some of the timeline and some of the main changes here. So in 2015, we have the number 44 notice. The goal of this regulation is to improve on the review efficiency and increase the whole review process to transparency. In 2016, we also had requirements of DMF for drug new classification. This is the number 80 notice that we've been talking about. It basically details a list of requirements for each module in the DMF, what you need to submit. In 2017 October, we had the number 42 notice. This regulation document aims to pave the way for some of the policy reformation that's coming later, such as MNH policy, joint review process, priority review, and approval, and such. In November, also in 2017, we had the number 146 notice. The core message of this announcement is really just one thing, which is that the joint review process of API excipients and packaging materials are officially in the run. So in 2019 June, we had announcement of State Food and Drug Administration, or NMPA, on further improving the related review, approval, and supervision of the drugs. That's the number 56 notice. In 2019 December, we had a new edition of the Chinese Drug Administration Law. In this new edition, it sort of established the annual report policy, and announced that API manufacturers register API on the online platform, along with excipients and packaging material to start the joint review. So this year, on April 30th, we have the draft for comments. In July, we will have the new drug registration administration law. So here I picked out some of the policies in number 56 notice, the new drug registration administration law, as well as the new draft for comments that's come out at the end of April, and aiming to do sort of like a parallel comparison here and show what's changed. So for number 56 notice that was announced in 2019, it was mentioned that the registrant shall submit the annual report of the previous year through the applicant window in the first quarter of each year. Now, this policy has been changed. There's a new draft for comments that is clearly stated that require the annual reports to be submitted within 3 months of approval date from the approval period, which is 1 year. And the new draft for comments, it was mentioned that CDE shall, when review the application of a new drug formulation, conduct an audit and test of the pharmaceutical excipients and packaging materials using the formulation if necessary. Such extended inspection can be imposed based on risk. And Article 34 mentioned that for pharmaceutical excipients and drug packaging materials that have passed the joint review, the status label on the registration platform will be updated. And for those who have not passed, it will not, or not yet carried out the joint review process, no updates on the status. And if the joint review of the excipients and packaging material fails, so does the application for the related formulation. It will not be approved. So here we have the new drug registration and administration law, number 27 notice. In this notice, it was re-emphasized authoritative position of CP in drug registration. If you're registering a product in China, the specification and limits really cannot be less stringent than CP, right? In Article 43, it was mentioned that The APIs used in generic drugs that are already marketed in China may apply for independent review and approval. In particular, if API excipient or packaging materials that have not passed the technical evaluation, the joint review application will also not be approved. So, in the new administration law, it was also the time window has also been specified for review. The time limit for review of individual application is 200 working days, and for the supplementary application, it was 16 working days. So that's it for sort of a walkthrough of the new changes and comparison between the laws and regulation. Hopefully you're still with me. Coming next, we'll talk about some more of like a detailed requirements for imported API DMF. There have been a lot of regulations and requirements of DMF, and these series of regulations really just aim to comply with ICH and make some sort of a more smooth transition to the eCTD format. As we all know, the eCTD format is not fully in the run yet, but the whole industry is looking forward to it, and we're waiting to welcome the full transition to this eCTD format as well. So before we talk about more detailed requirements, let's just take a look at the classification of drugs. Since March of 2016, the classification of chemicals has been changed. So the definition of new drug is now adjusted to never listed drugs domestically and abroad. So basically, global new drugs. And generic drugs has been defined as drugs with the same quality and efficacy as the originator drugs. So these has been changed, and there are a total of 5 classes of drugs today, and the requirements for submission for approval are all different. Here, class 5.1 is originator drugs marketed overseas, and class 5.2 is non-originator drugs marketed overseas, including APIs and their formulation. So today I will be talking about the submission process of class 5.2 APIs in China. So here's an overview sort of the entire process of registration. First, the overseas vendors will provide the DMF and obtain registration number at the applicant window from CDE's online platform. Then we choose independent review or joint review, along with joint review with the formulation, that is. So after completing the organization and sort of translation of the entire DMF files, we transfer all that DMF into a CD, and we mail that to CDE. So within 5 working days, CDE will initiate a format check to check the DMF materials. If there are some issues with administrative documents, or there are documents missing from any of the modules, the evaluators will ask those errors to be fixed and the missing documents to be sent. And the updated file should be sent and complete within 30 working days as well. If there are no files missing and you pass the format check, that means the CDE has officially accepted your evaluation request. So if you choose to do independent review, the next steps will be payment and testing. If you pass the independent review process, the approval status is marked as A. That's A as inactive, and if not, the approval status is I, which is inactive. If API hasn't been approved, the corresponding formulation that has joined the review will also not be approved either. And if you choose the independent review, you sort of have to wait for the formulation manufacturer to join you in the application process. And if the approval process on the formulation end is marked as A, that means the API on your end is also considered approval for marketing. So as I mentioned before, after passing the initial format check, the agent will receive 3 sheets of paperwork. They are each for acceptance for review, payment, and testing. So then comes the specification confirmation process, which is what I mean by testing. We will basically prepare 2 copies of supplement of confirmation process DMS and sending samples needed for testing to NIFDC. NIFDC will either keep the specification confirmation doc to themselves and do it over there, or assign to local testing facilities in other provinces. And they will send one of the copies as well as samples to that drug testing facility. So then the local drug testing facility will start the process. Not only will they test to see if the drug fits in compliance with the specification, we will also do method validation as well. After they complete the testing, the local facilities will then submit the results, report back to NIFDC. The NIFDC will then conduct a meeting to go through the results and finally send back the modified specification back to CDE and the agent. So the technical review process of CDE could initiate before, during, or after the specification confirmation process of NIFDC, right? Those 2 are independent work, actually. But before CDE reached the final conclusion of the technical review process, they will also have to wait for NIFDC's test report. So as of right now, it is still quite rare for API just to pass technical review process in one go. Supplementary notices are most likely to happen one way or another. And there has been a notice issued by NIFDC in 2016, clearly stating that the applicant for drug registration shall submit the samples as well as reference standards and supplementary DMS files to the corresponding drug inspection facilities within 4 months after receiving the supplementary notice sheet. So if supplementary notices, including like changes regarding to the specification, then specification confirmation, as well as the technical review process, those 2 will repeat again. If the product supplementary notice receives supplementary notice another time, same round repeats 1 more time. And then its status changed to A and product gets approved. That is if those 2 rounds of supplementary notice process goes well and nothing is wrong, and that means it gets approved. So after API is approved, if there are changes in the DMS, depending on whether it's major, medium, or minor changes, you prepare for supplementary applications or include them in the annual reports. There is also a re-registration after IDI has expired after 5 years. All of the segments are considered part of the molecule's registration lifecycle. So as you can see, In order to save time within each of these segments during the entire review process and sort of minimize the times we'll get supplementary notices, we will perform, at CSC, we'll also perform a technical review here. It is quite necessary process because upon the review stage, we can sort of foresee the problems in the DMF that may lead to an issue passing customs or maybe causing troubles in its domestic sales in the future. So after we identify those problems, we bring it up with our overseas partners and sort of work collaboratively to solve those problems. And then in that case, we avoid things getting escalated to CBD and solve them sort of firsthand. Next, I will talk about some of the common problems in the DMF. In the new draft for comments that came out at the end of April, it was clearly stated that the format will still be CTD and complying with number 80 notice as well. So those two haven't changed. And so let's talk about what those look like. So this is a CTD format of ICH, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. There are 5 modules in total. Among them, API manufacturers are only required to submit Module 2, QoS section, as well as Module 3, the quality section. So most often, a manufacturer who often obtained CEP certificates and have already registered molecules for USDMF. Their DMF are pretty good quality. However, their DMF may not comply with some of the specifics of Chinese requirements, or to say more clearly, what's required by number 80 notice. And so here is sort of like the main structure. Let me go back. The main structures of what's required by number 80 notice. Besides the main framework I listed over here, there are also number 1 to 8 documents that are also required to be submitted. As I mentioned, some of the DMFs have problems that are quite common that we found in the submission process. So let's go through some of the common problems that we have came across. So S.1 section is general information. Usually there are not that many problems in this section. If there are, it sort of shows through in the later sections of the DMS. So I will skip that section for now, and we come to number S, manufacture process and ink process controls. So manufacture process really is the core of the entire DMS. Some of the common problems we have seen in the sections are either the steps of RS are too short, that is the route of synthesis, are too short. The key starting materials and key intermediates cannot be identified correctly in the later sections because of this. Another problem that we see too often is the process diagram being too simple. So the detailed process parameters needs to be noted on there. You need to demonstrate sort of the compatibility of manufactured equipment and yield. The descriptions in process flow chart, detailed process descriptions, as well as process validation sections are not lining up. So those are a common problem that we've seen in the DMF. Another thing is the documents on key starting materials are missing. So the series of documents needed for KSM are actually a lot, especially in situations where the RS of APIs is relatively short. The impact of KSM in the final product needs to be reviewed more stringently, and the justification of key process parameters are not sufficient in some of the DMFs we have seen. And this section really should be supported with study data, right? You can't just list them down there and just call it a day. It has to be supported with real data. Another common problem that we've seen is S.2.4. The control of key intermediates is not being stringent enough. So sometimes the testing for key intermediates is quite simple. And actually, this comes back to S.3 section as well. In cases where the key intermediates are listed as a potential process impurity, or where the crude API is actually listed as an intermediate, the methodology of the related substances needs to be reviewed more carefully in those cases, and then it needs to show in the control of key intermediates as well. So lastly, I will mention the S.2.6 section. The manufacturer process development is incomplete. So here, number 80 notice asks for justification of how you settle down on your current route of synthesis, or more specifically, from laboratory scale, pilot scale, all the way to commercial scale production, what changes you made to the key process parameters in manufacture process. Here, you sort of have to show a dynamic process of how your manufacture process has evolved and changed and improved. All right, so coming up, we have S.3 characteristics section. So the first part is S.3.1 structure elucidation. Unless the structure of your molecule is really simple, then doing an IR, UV, mass, and MMR, maybe elemental analysis, those 5 is sufficient. In other cases where your molecules is more complicated structures, has polymorphism, or if it contains water molecules, additional methods such as TGA, DSC, or XRD needs to be employed in the structure elucidation section. S.3.2 impurity profile section. Here you sort of have to demonstrate like the production of impurities, right? Whether it was introduced via starting materials or it's a side chain product during the synthesis. You have to show its trace and how you control it in your process. This section has been one of the focal points of technical review. Obviously, we know that impurities are generally classified in categories of organic, inorganic, residual solvents, heavy metals, degradation impurities, as well as genotoxic impurities. So the main idea here is from the point of generating that impurity all the way to the API final product. So the impurity should be controlled, right, throughout its journey. And you need to demonstrate and show that clearly in this section. So coming next, we have S.4, quality control of API. First, let's talk about specification and analytical methods. As I mentioned before, the new drug administration law stress the really emphasize the specification of imported drug cannot be lower or less stringent than the technical requirements of CP. So, I mean, this is sort of a mandatory requirement if you're importing a drug into China. And it was also mentioned in the administration law, if it's lower or less stringent than CP, it should be justified and provide with sufficient data. And they ask to show your reasoning clearly. Here, another thing needs to be paid attention to is that analytical methods and method validation needs to sort of correspond to each other well. And if there are sort of any discrepancies, the evaluators will pick it up. S.4.3, the analytical methodology is also another focal point of technical review. If there is sort of discrepancies in methodology, it would mean that the method may be needed to be redeveloped, because even if you don't, you can cause a lot of trouble upon specification confirmation process, right? So in S.4 section, we also asked to provide a quality comparison between the generic drug and the originator drug, as well as impurity profile comparison of API. So as we know, the originator APIs are almost impossible to get your hands on. So this has been one of the common deficiencies as well. So in S.5 reference standards section, it is required to include a document of all of the reference standards that was used throughout the entire study process. For pharmacopeia standards, the invoices, photos, COAs, labels, batch number, and MSDS and purity, all of these info needs to be provided. And for outsourced standards or in-house standards, it's manufacture process, COA, structure elicitation information, specification, assay, and purity needs to be provided as well. For S.5, usually we just coordinate well with the partners and fix up on any sort of the insufficient parts. And usually there aren't any major problems in S.5. So for S.6, container closure system section, here we just ask to provide packaging type, manufacturer information, registration, certificate number, certificate validate. In this section, you sort of have to just clearly explain how it was packaged, what is the materials for the inner and outer packaging. There hasn't been many supplementary notices on S.2, S.6, so I won't spend much time here either. There are generally not many problems here. So S.7 stability section. Stability testing is the basis for how we nail down the storage condition, as well as how we settle down on the validate for the finished product, right? So usually here we ask for data of 3 batches. That is larger than pilot scale. Usually, we suggest our partners to use the 3 process validation batches for stability testing data. Now, the minimum study period required for accelerated stability testing is at least 6 months, and same for the long-term stability testing. Stress study is also required to provide in this section. Stress study is a specific Chinese requirement, and it's different from force degradation study. In S.7, for impurities that exceeds identification limit, further studying needs to be sort of shown and conducted to justify the limits for those who have exceeded identification limit. This is sort of the same as what ICH has specified, so I won't talk too much about that here. Another thing is the spectral diagrams of each stability testing time point needs to be provided. So the diagrams here, or the spectrums here, needs to comply with data integrity. If there are any signs of faking the data, that's just a direct non-approval. And we had those cases before. So that's a situation we definitely need to avoid. Trying to submit your DMS to China. So that is all for sort of like the requirements of of DMS files. Now I wanted to show you this is a summary of approved imported drugs. It is the statistics of registration number that sort of this is the last year's data. Last year in China, there have been 3,100 IDL certificates granted, which in those IDL certificates, about 117 were held by Indian enterprises. So among these, we have mainly just chemicals, really. It accounts for 88%. So now I would like to talk about some of the characteristics of Indian API with a goal to introduce Indian APIs to Chinese domestic formulators. There are a lot of pharmaceutical enterprises in India. Among them, there are 650 enterprises that only produce, and more than 600 have been approved by US FDA, and more than 700 have been approved by EDQM. Those numbers are still increasing today. So the globalization of Indian pharmaceutical industry really began in the 1970s. After 2000, the export of pharmaceutical products grown rapidly from $600 million in 5 years to $2 billion in 2005. So the numbers sort of have tripled in 5 years. And the globalization of Indian pharmaceutical industry began in began a lot earlier than our country. And India mainly exports formulations. API actually only accounts for 45% of its total drug exports. So Indians supply 40% of the global API market demand as well. There's also needs to be mentioned that there is a lack of intermediates in the Indian market. More than 60% of the intermediates for API productions comes from China. So Indian API manufacturers manufacture API with the goal of selling that API in the market. So oftentimes they have already acquired CEP certificates and they're actively submitting USDMS. Here I mentioned the point of real production because in most cases of Chinese domestic formulation manufacturers, the goal of submitting their API DMS to CDE is mainly in service of or in service of supporting their formulation they're going to sell themselves. So it's not really intended for the market purchase. So there are also a lot of barriers that prevent Indian manufacturers from like dominating the Chinese market, such as tariffs and value-added tax which starts from 0%. In the international market, India and China can only seize the market using the advantages of quality and price that they offer. And in some of the well-established and well-regulated markets, such as European, American markets, Indian enterprises have sort of a congenital advantage of having CGMP and from entering that market early on. China and India are world's leading API suppliers. The APIs in China and in India have their own characteristics. There is a sense of complementarity in two countries' products that they offer, which makes room for cooperation, a lot of cooperation opportunities for the two countries. In recent years, there has been a lot of series of policy changes in China, such as the demand for quality equivalency between the generic and originator drugs, as well as API and formulation joint review, as well as for Part 7 procurement of drugs. Plus, on top of all of these, we also have a more stringent environmental laws in place that's only going to get even harsher, as well as the monopoly phenomenon that has already been existing in the API market. So the supply for Chinese domestic APIs has always been tense, but it may have reached a tension point. And more people are sort of looking forward for substitutions in the import API market. And for domestic Chinese formulators who plans to list their formulations in United States or in Europe or in Japan, they can choose APIs from Indian pharmaceutical companies because chances are they're already established and listed in those well-regulated markets. It's only going to make it easier for domestic formulators. Not only will it save cost of R&D, approval, considering just long-term, authentic, and globalized production of Indian enterprises, as they help to provide a more safe and stable and low-cost and high-quality API source for the domestic formulators. So lastly, combining with the experiences from being an agent and also from our domestic sales, I sort of like to reflect on the RA work itself, as well as share some of our company's footing and strategy under the current state of regulation policy changes. I would also like to share maybe just a list on some of the conveniences and as well as potential worries that choosing Indian APIs could bring to domestic formulators. So as of right now, the cost of registering a molecule successfully in China costs about $150,000. That is with various sorts of registration fees and labor costs considered. So as an agent, we cover all of those fees. And we cover them in exchange for exclusive agency for the API molecules that we signed on to sell domestically. So, as I also mentioned before, from our experiences, chances of API molecules get supplementary notices are still quite high. Typically, the fastest molecules can get approved is about 1.5 years to 2.5 years. That is with one-time supplementary notice. So the time cost invested into getting these molecules approved requires RA work to be done with efficiency and in a pace that gets molecules approved with quality and with speed. So going forward, with the new drug administration laws coming up, the 4 month time window to complete the supplementary notice will be strictly informed. So manufacturers really can't rely on extensions and to save themselves anymore. This meant for us RA, we need to tighten the standard of reviewing these DMFs and focus more on manufacture process and quality sections, that's point 2 and that's point 4, during the technical review. And also require, as well as closer communication and better cooperations between the partners. So that is my opinion. So under the new laws, all of the DMFs submitted before automatically turns to A, right? So some of the molecules may be submitted before doing these new series of new drug regulation law has came out, because as you saw earlier, pretty much there is a law coming out every year. So some of the old products that have submitted before these new laws, they don't necessarily fit the requirements of these new laws. However, their status turned approved as well. So during the joint review process, if the formulation manufacturer use those APIs whose quality does not fit the requirements, that's an automatically non-approval on the formulation end. And in the past 5 years, the Chinese regulation laws has been sort of tying the formulators with more and more responsibilities. They're required, quote unquote, to take on main responsibility of drug quality system. So if the domestic formulators join review with those MTA APIs, they will automatically bring risks to the formulators. Under current regulation laws, APIs don't necessarily need to pass the independent review themselves. They can just wait and find a formulator who are willing to take them on into the joint review process and just to get approved with them. So that all of these is to say it impose a lot of risks on domestic formulators using APIs that have not passed the technical review process independently. So understanding all of these risks involved, CSC has chosen the route of independent review process for all of the APIs that we have signed. So no matter how the policy have changed or if there are new laws coming up next year, the domestic formulators can always choose APIs that have passed the independent review and sort of use them at ease. So, as I mentioned before, the benefit of choosing Indian API for formulation is really just the globalization. Indian RA staff have a complete and a mature understanding of GMP and ICH, and they put together the data for the purpose of selling their API into the market. So, that results a very authentic DMF and a good quality DMF. And since some of the manufacturers have already submitted their DMFs to, US, to Europe, and to Japan, they can even use their experiences in these successfully submission of molecules in those regulated markets to guide their work in RA, guide their work in registering in China. So that is a real good benefit as well as convenience of choosing Indian API. However, it's also sort of like a double-edged sword because China right now is still largely considered as a not well-regulated market. So in cases where APIs does need to or deem to fit the requirements of they are already satisfied with the requirements of the well-regulated markets. We have the API manufacturers are less inclined to change or modify their DMFs to comply with Chinese requirements. So that's a potential hassle, maybe you can call that, it could bring. So because of the barriers entering into Chinese markets, along with some of the fierce competition with Chinese domestic products, causing the molecules that enter China are usually more or less products with less production quantity. So these so-called small products, quote unquote, may not be valued as the same level as the star products inside the Indian manufacturer site. So sometimes it is hard for agents to get EMS from manufacturers partners timely. In those scenarios, CSC usually signed multiple products at once, plus the sales networks that we have built with the partners, and as well as the submission of molecules in series. All of these can provide a well-rounded solution to that problem. So in addition, in the process of submitting for a generic drug, fighting to be the first generic drug and get ahead to enter the market has really becoming like a priority for many manufacturers. So API DMFs sort of play more of a supporting role in service of the formulation, right? So the Chinese domestic formulation companies really struggle to get a gauge of just how good and the quality of these API DMFs are. CSC have a long-term trading experiences. We also have our local Indian RA team that can ensure that our domestic clients can get the info and get the help they really needed. So CSC is founded in 2002, and since 2004, we have introduced Indian APIs to China, and on the basis of covering all the registration fees, and we have become a leader in such business model. Our CSC is a company guided by trade, but RA is really at the core of our service, at the service we provide here. We have wonderful teams in both China and India working closely together. Just the year of 2017, I think in that year alone, we submitted about 30-something molecules of the supplementary notices. And so far, CSE have 58 approved and listed molecules, 41 molecules awaits for approval, and 131 molecules awaits to submit. So in summary of my talk today, I would like to personally welcome all cooperation with CSE and sincerely hope that domestic formulators will choose Indian APIs for the benefits and the advantages it brings. Thank you all very much for listening, and thanks again for CPHI to provide me this opportunity to share my talk today. 我讲完了哈。